the saint whose heart was a clock. High upon a lonely hill, far from the reach of the sea and the smoke of towns, there stood an abbey whose name had been forgotten by all but the wind. The locals, when they spoke of it at all, called it the Abbey of the Turning Hours, for the bells there rang not according to the sun, but to a rhythm known only to themselves. The sound drifted down the valley like breath, slow and deep, and the villagers below said that the bells could lull even the restless dead to sleep. No road led directly to the abbey. One reached it only by a long, narrow path that wound upward through forest and fog, past trees whose branches grew twisted like the ribs of ancient beasts. Moss covered everything, the stones, the bark, even the air seemed green at times, and the scent of damp earth never faded. It was said that once one began the climb, time itself slowed. The steps between heartbeats grew longer, the thoughts between breaths stretched thin. The abbey was built of pale stone quarried from the mountain itself. Its walls, though worn by centuries, stood firm and straight, like something that had grown from the earth rather than been constructed upon it. No ornament adorned its exterior, only plain arches and narrow windows of leaded glass through which the faintest glimmer of candlelight could sometimes be seen on misted nights. At the highest point of the abbey rose a slender tower, capped with a weathered copper dome that turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though following the unseen movement of the stars. Within those walls lived a small community of brothers. They were neither many nor young. Some had come to the abbey seeking peace, others to escape the noise of the world, and a few simply because they had nowhere else to go. Their days were measured by quiet ritual, the ringing of bells, the recitation of psalms, the tending of the gardens that clung to the mountainside. Their voices rarely rose above a whisper, and even their footsteps seemed subdued, as though softened by years of walking upon the same stones. The brothers believed the abbey existed outside the normal flow of time. Some claimed to have lived there 30 years, but remembered only 10. Others swore they had arrived last winter, yet their beards had turned white. None of them argued. The passing of years meant little in a place where the hours themselves could stretch or fold like the pages of a forgotten book. Among them was an old man named Brother Anselm. He had been at the abbey longer than anyone could remember, and no one knew when he had first arrived. His face was pale and finely lined, his beard long and white, his eyes pale as glass. When he walked, his steps made no sound. He spoke little, yet when he did, his words carried the weight of still water. Brother Anselm kept the abbey's time. That was his duty, his devotion, and perhaps his burden. He tended the great clock in the tower, the one whose gears turned with the slow precision of planets, whose pendulum swung not by seconds, but by breaths. The clock was older than the abbey itself, older perhaps than the mountain upon which it stood. Its face bore no numbers, only faint lines like veins in marble. And when it struck, it did not chime but hum, a deep and resonant tone that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Each morning before dawn, Brother Anselm would climb the narrow spiral stair to the tower. The air there was always colder, filled with the faint scent of oil and iron. He would light a single candle, though the flame hardly touched the darkness, and he would listen to the slow breathing of the clock. Its gears moved with a sound like the sighing of wind through old trees. Sometimes when he leaned close, he thought he could hear a second rhythm beneath it, a heartbeat, faint but steady. It was said that long ago, before the abbey had been built, a hermit lived upon that hill. He was a man who spoke to no one, who prayed in silence, and lived on berries and roots. When he died, the villagers found his body seated in meditation, his hands folded upon his chest. And within his chest, so the story went, there was no heart, only a small intricate clock of brass and bone, ticking softly. The villagers buried him where he sat, and years later the abbey was raised upon that very ground. Whether Brother Anselm knew that story or not, none could say. He never spoke of it. But those who had seen him closely, when he bent to pour water at the refectory table, or when he lifted his robe to climb the stairs, claimed that sometimes in the silence they could hear a faint ticking sound, not from the tower, but from within his own breast. Brother Anselm's cell was the smallest in the abbey. Its single window looked east toward the edge of the valley, where dawn crept slowly each morning through layers of mist. On the wall opposite the bed hung a single object, a round disk of polished brass engraved with symbols no one could read. He wound it every evening with a small key, though it had no visible hands or markings. The brothers asked him once what it measured, and he only said, "Patience." The abbey's rhythm was precise, though the world beyond it was often not. The villagers below told time by the bells that drifted down through the fog. They would say 7 for waking, 9 for prayer, 12 for silence, 3 for reflection. And yet, sometimes, the bells rang at strange hours, or not at all. Sometimes the sound would linger for minutes after the ringing stopped, as if echoing in some other realm. In the evenings, the brothers gathered in the refectory. They ate simple food, bread, broth, the occasional apple from the abbey's trees, and they spoke in measured tones, if they spoke at all. After the meal, one of them would read from an old book, lives of saints or accounts of miracles so old that they had become like dreams. The reading voice would rise and fall gently, lulling even the listener's thoughts into stillness. When Brother Anselm read, he never used the book. He recited from memory, his voice soft and deliberate, as if each word came from some faraway place. The others said that when he spoke, time itself seemed to pause. Candles burned lower, but the flame did not flicker. The wind outside stopped howling. The clock in the tower continued to turn, but no one heard it. One winter evening, as the snow fell thick upon the roofs, a traveler came to the abbey gates. He was half frozen, his horse lame, his face hidden by frost. The brothers took him in, warmed him, and gave him food and rest. He said little, but when he awoke, he asked the abbot a single question. "Is it true that you keep time here?" The abbot smiled faintly. "Time keeps us," he replied. The traveler stayed 3 days. He wandered the cloisters, listening to the bells, watching the light move across the stones. On his last night, he asked to see the clock in the tower. Brother Anselm led him up the narrow stair, each step echoing in the still air. At the top, by the great iron mechanism, the traveler stood in awe. He said, "I hear it beating." Brother Anselm nodded. "Yes, it lives." "And if it should stop?" asked the traveler. Brother Anselm looked out through the high window, where snowflakes drifted past the glass like falling stars. "Then," he said, "the hill will sleep, and so will we." When the traveler left, the brothers found that his footprints in the snow did not lead down the mountain, but out into the forest where no path existed. Some said he had been an angel. Others said he had been Death himself, checking the hours. Brother Anselm said nothing, but that night the clock's tone was softer, almost tender, as though aware that it had been spoken of.
The days passed, slow and circular, like the turning of the great gears above. Seasons melted into one another. Flowers bloomed, withered, bloomed again. The world below the mountain changed, but on the hill the rhythm remained constant. And through it all, Brother Anselm continued his patient tending, oiling the gears, adjusting the pendulum, listening to the faint heartbeat within the brass. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, when all the abbey slept and the candles had burned to pools of wax, Brother Anselm would rise from his bed and place a hand upon his chest. Beneath his ribs, beneath the fabric of his robe, something ticked, slow, deliberate, endless. It had no malice, no mercy, only rhythm. He would sit in silence, listening to it, until dawn brushed pale light upon his window once more. And in the valley below, the villagers would awaken to the sound of the bell, marking an hour that perhaps belonged not to them, but to the saint whose heart was a clock. Time, at the Abbey of the Turning Hours, did not move in a straight line. It flowed in circles, in eddies, in quiet reversals that no one could chart. There were mornings when the dawn seemed to linger forever, the light refusing to rise beyond the horizon, and others when day leapt forward, carrying the brothers from matins to vespers in what felt like a single breath. The abbey's sundial, long ago placed in the central cloister, had become a kind of joke among the brothers. Its shadow never seemed to match the sky, as though the sun itself bowed to the tower's strange clock. Sometimes, at noon, the shadow would vanish entirely, leaving the dial blank and silvered by light. At other times, in the deepest night, a thin shadow would appear across the stone, dark and sure, though no moon shone above. When asked about it, Brother Anselm would only murmur, "Not all light comes from the sky." No one pressed him further. The abbey itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the clock. Doors swelled and relaxed with the cold. Candles burned longer than they should. The air in the corridors carried a faint pulse, a tremor that might have been the echo of the tower's pendulum, or something deeper, a pulse beneath the world. Each season brought subtle changes. In spring, the air was fragrant with wet stone and growing moss. In summer, the heat gathered in the cloisters until the walls seemed to hum. Autumn draped the valley in a soft veil of mist, and the bells took on a deeper tone, as if sounding through water. In winter, the snow muffled all sound, and the abbey became a dream within a dream, a place where time slept under white blankets. Brother Anselm moved through all these seasons unchanged. His hands grew thinner, his hair whiter, but his pace never faltered. The younger monks, if they could be called young, watched him with quiet reverence. He was not abbot nor prior, yet everyone deferred to him. When he entered a room, conversation ceased naturally, not out of fear, but because his presence seemed to gather silence around him like a cloak. The abbot, Father Audric, once confessed privately that he feared the day Brother Anselm would stop tending the clock, for then, he said, "I think the world will lose its measure." No one laughed when he said this. Few besides Brother Anselm were allowed inside the tower. The stairs were old and steep, and the air at the top thin and cold. But on rare occasions, feast days, or when the clock required some great adjustment, a novice might be sent to assist him. They always returned pale, speaking little, and often woke that night from strange dreams. One such novice, Brother Simeon, described the tower years later, when age had loosened his tongue. He said the clock filled nearly the entire chamber, a labyrinth of brass, glass and blackened iron, its gears moving so slowly that some seemed still. In its center hung the great pendulum, long as a man's height, swinging not with the tick of seconds, but with the sigh of breath. The sound of it was unlike any clock Simeon had ever heard. It was not mechanical, it was alive, like the beating of a vast heart. Each movement stirred the air, each tone vibrated in his chest. He said he could feel it long after he descended the stairs, even in sleep. Brother Anselm, during that visit, had spoken almost nothing. He moved with tender care among the gears, adjusting small screws, brushing dust from brass teeth, placing a drop of oil upon a hinge as though anointing it. When he listened, he closed his eyes completely, tilting his head slightly to one side, like someone listening for a distant voice in the dark. At one point, Simeon asked timidly, "Brother, what makes it move?" Anselm's eyes opened. "Faith," he said simply. Simeon thought he meant it figuratively, but now, in his old age, he was not so sure.
In the abbey's library, a long, cool room where dust drifted like snow in shafts of light, there was a single locked cabinet. Few had ever seen what it held, but rumor spoke of a book, bound in black leather, its pages made not of parchment, but of something faintly translucent, like the skin of an onion. Brother Anselm had written in it, or so it was said. Not words, but marks, small looping patterns that no one could read. Once a year, on the longest night of winter, he would take the key from his robe, open the cabinet, and spend the dark hours writing. The brothers never asked what he wrote. They only knew that when he finished, the clock in the tower would strike once, a sound deep and soft, like the earth breathing in its sleep. Some whispered that the book recorded the abbey's true time, not hours, but moments of meaning, instants that stitched together the thin fabric of eternity. Others believed it was a confession, written not to God, but to the mechanism that pulsed in the tower. Whatever its purpose, the book was known among the brothers as the Book of Quiet Hours. Below the abbey, life followed simpler rhythms. The villagers plowed their fields, raised their cattle, sang their old songs by firelight. But always, in the still hours of morning and night, they listened for the bells. Some said the sound of them cured headaches, eased childbirth, or calmed restless infants. Others said that when the bells rang at midnight, a soul somewhere was freed from suffering. There was one old woman in the village. Her name was Magda of the Hollow, who claimed she could hear the clock itself from her cottage. She said that when it slowed, she knew a storm was coming. When it quickened, she would light a candle for the dead. Once, long ago, a group of townsfolk climbed the hill, hoping to see the mysterious clock for themselves. They reached the gate just before sunset, but as they crossed into the abbey grounds, a fog rose around them so thick they could not see one another. The bells began to ring, slow and deep, and when the fog lifted, it was morning again. They found themselves back in their own village, their boots clean, their hands empty. None of them ever tried again. As for Brother Anselm's origins, they were the oldest mystery of all. Some believed he had once been a scholar, driven from the city for heretical studies of time and matter. Others said he was a miracle child, born on an hour that had no number, whose first cry was perfectly in rhythm with a clock's chime. A few whispered darker things, that he had been an apprentice to a clockmaker who had built a machine too precise for human hands, and in punishment, heaven had bound its rhythm to his heart. But Anselm never confirmed or denied any story. To him, time itself seemed without beginning or end, and so too his life. In truth, there were hints. Beneath his bed was an old wooden chest, lined with faded cloth. Inside lay fragments, a compass with no needle, a piece of glass curved like the lens of an eye, and a thin sheet of parchment bearing a single phrase in delicate ink. When the last bell rings, remember the first sound. No one but he ever saw these things. But on nights when the wind was loud and the mountains groaned, Anselm would open the chest, sit beside it, and stare at those relics for hours. His lips would move faintly, as though repeating a forgotten prayer. It was in the 47th year of Father Odric's abbacy, though perhaps fewer, perhaps more, depending on how one counted, that strange signs began. The first was subtle. The sunlight over the valley began to fade earlier each day, not by the calendar, but by feeling. Even at noon, shadows grew longer, and the air seemed thicker, as if filled with dust that no one could see. The villagers noticed it first. "The hill is stealing our light," they murmured. Then came the dreams. Men and women woke in the night to the sound of ticking, steady and low, echoing from the earth beneath their floors. Children whispered of seeing lights moving in the forest, like candles carried by invisible hands. At the abbey, the brothers began to forget the days of the week. Their chants drifted out of order. Bread baked too long or not long enough. The bells rang unevenly. Even the clock's hum took on a strange, strained tone, like a voice speaking through sleep. Brother Anselm worked longer hours in the tower. His face grew thinner, almost translucent, and his hands trembled faintly when he prayed. Yet his eyes shone with the same calm light, as though he already knew what was coming. One night, when the moon was a faint sliver over the hills, Father Odric climbed the tower to speak with him. The steps seemed longer than he remembered, and the air grew colder with each turn. When he reached the top, Anselm was standing beside the great pendulum, his hand upon the brass as it swung. "Brother," the abbot said softly, "is something amiss?" "No more than ever," he said. "The clock sounds slower." "All things slow in time." "Is it dying?" "No, it is resting." And when he said this, the clock behind him gave a low, almost human sigh.
After that night, Father Odric rarely spoke of what he had seen in the tower. He returned to his chambers, pale and silent, and though he continued his duties, those who knew him best said he prayed more often and longer, and always with his hand pressed faintly against his chest, as though listening for something. Brother Anselm, meanwhile, went on tending the clock. Day after day he could be found among the gears, brushing away the fine dust that drifted from the rafters, tightening the old bolts, polishing the pendulum's brass surface until it gleamed like a captured sun. His movements were measured, reverent, and silent. Sometimes, when the rain came, he would pause by the narrow window and watch the water slide down the stone. The valley below blurred into soft gray tones, the fields like worn parchment, the river like a faint line of ink. He seemed to draw comfort from the sound of it, a steady rhythm that mingled with the heart-like beating of the clock behind him. As the weeks passed, the changes within the abbey grew more noticeable. The brothers began to speak in whispers, not out of fear, but because the air itself seemed to demand quiet. Even the birds that nested in the roof beams sang less frequently, as though time between notes had stretched too far. The great bell that marked the hours took on a tone deeper and more resonant than before. When it struck, the sound traveled for miles, across the river, through the forest, into the fields where the villagers labored. Some said it sounded like a heart beating within the earth. Others said it was the sound of the world remembering itself. There were moments when the brothers, kneeling in prayer, felt a peculiar sensation, as if their hearts skipped a beat, or as if some invisible current passed through them, aligning their breathing for a brief instant with something vast and unseen. Then the feeling would fade, leaving only a trace of warmth, like a fading echo of sunlight on stone. Brother Simeon, now grown into a quiet man of middle years, spoke once to Anselm about it. He said that during Vespers he had felt his pulse move in time with the tolling bell. Anselm simply nodded as though this were inevitable. He said, "All hearts listen, only a few hear." That night the wind carried a low hum through the corridors, not quite a song, not quite a voice. It was the sound of time itself, the soft breathing of hours unseen. In the valley, strange stories continued to spread. Children claimed to hear the ticking beneath their pillows. Shepherds said their flocks stood still at dusk, all facing the abbey. Travelers who came from distant towns swore that their shadows lengthened as they approached the hill, though the sun had not moved. Magda of the Hollow, the old woman who claimed to hear the clock, told a farmer one morning that the abbey was dreaming. "It's asleep," she said, "and the world dreams with it. But dreams have hearts too, and sometimes they wake." Few listened to her, but those who did began to light candles by their windows at night, as if to mark their place in the dark in case the dream forgot them. Within the abbey walls, time continued to dissolve. Bread took longer to rise, ink refused to dry. The candles burned down to their wicks without smoke. And through it all, Brother Anselm's routine never faltered. He awoke before dawn. He walked the cloisters with a slow, deliberate step. He climbed the tower to tend the heart of the abbey, that vast engine of time whose breath now matched his own. When he placed his hand upon its casing, the metal felt warm. When he leaned close, he could hear it whisper, not in words, but in rhythm, a language older than speech. Sometimes it seemed to him that the sound came not from the mechanism itself, but from within his ribs. At such moments he would close his eyes and stand perfectly still, and the difference between body and clock, between heartbeat and pendulum, would vanish. He would stand thus for what might have been minutes or hours. It was impossible to tell, until the spell broke and he remembered himself. Then he would descend, resume his tasks, and speak to no one of what he felt. It was in those months that the brothers began to notice small signs of change in Anselm. His eyes, once gray, had taken on a faint golden hue, as though reflecting some hidden light. His steps grew slower but surer, his movements more precise. He seemed never to tire, and yet his shadow grew thinner, fainter, as though the sunlight could no longer quite find him. One evening, while polishing the lanterns in the refectory, Brother Simeon looked up and saw Anselm standing motionless in the doorway. He was watching the light flicker across the table, his expression serene. "You are late for supper," Simeon said gently. Anselm smiled, but did not answer. He turned, and, for a moment, Simeon saw something impossible. The faint suggestion of gears moving beneath the fabric of his robe, a pattern of motion too subtle to be real. Then it was gone. After that night, Simeon began to record the hours of the abbey more carefully,
marking each bell toll and each silence in a small notebook. But the entries soon made no sense. Days repeated, nights overlapped. The same hour seemed to arrive twice. The abbey had begun to slip its moorings in time. At the height of that long, dim winter, the sun rose only a little above the hills, lingering there as if afraid to climb. The snow fell ceaselessly, but softly, and the valley grew quiet under its weight. The clock in the tower slowed until its pendulum swung only once every few breaths. Each motion was a ceremony, a vast inhalation, a pause, and exhalation that seemed to stir the very air of the world. And then, one night, it stopped. There was no sound, no final chime, no sigh of winding down, only silence, the kind of silence that presses against the bones, heavy and complete. The brothers woke one by one, sensing it. They rose from their pallets, lit candles, gathered in the corridors without speaking. The air felt strange, thick, and unmoving. The flames of their candles stood straight and tall. When they climbed the tower, they found Brother Anselm standing before the clock, his hands folded over his chest. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed upon the pendulum that hung perfectly still. For a long time no one spoke. Then Father Roderick stepped forward and placed his shoulder on Anselm's. It was warm. Underneath, faintly, there was a pulse. But the clock, the great machine of brass and glass, the heart of the abbey, was utterly silent.
In the months that followed the vanishing of Brother Anselm, life at St. Baron's Abbey returned, outwardly, to its ordered quiet. The monks still rose before dawn. They still filed into the chapel in their long, dark robes. The psalms were still sung, and the candles still burned their calm yellow light. But beneath the surface of those familiar hours, something had changed. It began subtly, as all changes of great magnitude do. A bell that struck once too few, a morning that seemed longer than it should, a sunset that lingered long past its proper hour. Brother Simeon, who had kept careful records of the hours ever since that winter when time first began to stutter, found that his ink dried before he could finish his entries. The quills split in his hand. When he tried to count the hours between prime and terce, his thoughts drifted and returned to find the candles shorter, the air colder, and the world quieted. And yet the great clock in the tower ticked faithfully on, slow, deliberate, patient. Its rhythm filled the air of the monastery like breath itself, a constant pulse that no longer belonged merely to metal and spring, but to something greater, something living. Some nights, when the moon hung low and white above the hills, the brothers thought they could hear another heartbeat answering it, echoing faintly from the stones of the cloister walls. The new abbot, Father Odric, kept his counsel. He said little about the changes, though he felt them as keenly as any man. The silence between bells grew wider, softer, more dreamlike. He began to notice that the prayers lasted longer, though they spoke no more words than before. The sound of the wind through the tower seemed to stretch like a drawn thread, the notes of the organ during vespers trembling as if suspended in air. The brothers noticed other things too. When they walked through the cloisters, their reflections in the windows sometimes lagged behind. When they passed the fountain, the water seemed to fall more slowly, like glass turning to honey. When they lay down to sleep, some said they dreamed for days, only to wake before dawn as though no time had passed at all. None of them spoke of these things openly. The rule demanded silence, and even if it had not, there were no words for such experiences. It was as if the monastery itself were breathing slower than the world outside, or perhaps the world outside had quickened, leaving the monastery behind. One late afternoon, Brother Simeon went up to the clock tower alone. The stairway spiraled endlessly upward through the dim light. Dust motes drifted like snowflakes, catching the thin beam of the setting sun through the arrow-slit windows. When he reached the top, he paused before the vast mechanism. The clock's pendulum swung with its slow, solemn rhythm. But there was something else now. A faint sound beneath the metal beat, a soft murmur like distant prayer. He leaned close, and for a moment he thought he heard words, though in no language he knew. They seemed to say his name. Simeon drew back sharply, his breath catching. The metal was warm beneath his fingertips, the same living warmth he remembered from Anselm's shoulder on that last morning. He whispered, "Brother, are you there?" The pendulum swung once more, a deep, calm arc, and though no answer came, Simeon felt a strange peace settle over him, as if the question itself had been understood and answered in silence. He knelt, crossed himself, and prayed. That evening, the bell tolled 7 times, though there were only supposed to be 6 bells between Vespers and Compline. No one remarked upon it. It was simply accepted, as one accepts the change of weather or the turning of the leaves. And so a new rhythm emerged, one that did not match the sun or the stars, but seemed to follow the slow breathing of the abbey's unseen heart. They called them the hours that never were. The monks did not name them aloud, but they knew when they came. The air grew still, the candles dimmed without wind, the shadows grew long and soft, curling around the arches like living things. During those hours, voices carried differently. The sound of footsteps on stone echoed twice, once immediately and again, faintly, a heartbeat later. And if one listened closely, one could hear the whispering of gears, not only from the tower, but from the walls, the floors, even from one's own pulse. It was not frightening. It was strangely soothing. Time itself seemed to loosen its grip, to flow like water between fingers. In the scriptorium, Brother Francis found that his hands no longer cramped when copying texts. The letters flowed easily, beautifully, as though guided by unseen assistants. He began to illuminate the margins with delicate filigree, patterns of circles and spirals that resembled clockwork more than vines or flowers. When he finished one of his manuscripts, he set down his quill and realized he couldn't remember when he had begun. The ink was dry. The candles had burned down to stubs. Outside, dawn was rising again. In the garden, Brother Joseph noticed that the plants seemed to grow differently. Some herbs that usually withered in winter stayed green. Others bloomed out of season. The bees worked longer hours, buzzing softly under the cool light. He too lost track of time. One morning, while pruning the rosemary, he looked up and found frost glittering on the branches, though he could have sworn it had been summer only a day before. He went to the refectory, confused, and found the other monks already there, eating in silence. None looked surprised to see him. It was as if the passing of seasons had become as fluid as the passing of seconds. The villagers below began to mark strange occurrences as well. They said the river sometimes flowed backwards for a heartbeat, that the shadows of the abbey's tower fell in 2 directions at once, that timepieces brought up the hill, watches, sundials, hourglasses, ceased to function entirely once they crossed the gate. Children who played too near the abbey swore they heard music without source, the faint chiming of glass bells, the murmur of invisible choirs, the rhythmic ticking of a heartbeat that was not their own. The adults dismissed these stories, but they too noticed that days near the abbey felt longer, that their sleep grew deeper, that dreams lasted whole nights and yet seemed to stretch beyond morning. Farmers began to measure planting and harvest not by sun or moon, but by the toll of the abbey bell, which they trusted more than the sky. Inside, the monks grew accustomed to their new rhythm. The abbot wrote to other houses of the order, describing the phenomenon, though his letters often went unanswered or returned long after being sent, as though the messengers had passed through a veil of slower time. Once a letter came from the archbishop himself, dated 2 years after it had been written. It spoke of a commission of inquiry, of scholars and theologians who had traveled to St. Verin's to study the temporal disturbance. But they never arrived. Seasons passed, no visitors came. The world beyond seemed to grow distant, dreamlike, as though the monastery were being gently set apart, lifted from the flow of common time into its own quiet orbit. But the monks were content. Their prayers deepened. Their work grew more precise. They slept soundly and woke rested, though no one could say how long they had slept. One night during Compline, Father Odric felt his own heartbeat slow until it matched the clock's deep rhythm. He placed his hand upon his chest, just as Anselm once had, and for the first time he did not fear the stillness that followed. He dreamt of corridors filled with gears that turned silently, not of metal but of light. He dreamt of Anselm standing beside the pendulum, his face calm, his chest open to reveal the golden motion within, not a wound but a window. When Odric woke, his pillow was damp with tears, though he could not tell if they were of sorrow or joy. The hours that never were continued. They did not appear every day. They came unbidden, sometimes before dawn, sometimes after sunset, sometimes in the midst of prayer or silence or sleep. During those hours, the world seemed to breathe differently. The air carried a faint scent of oil and incense. Light pooled in strange places, catching on dust motes like stars suspended mid-fall. And always, always, the soft, steady heartbeat of the clock, vast and patient, echoing through every stone and every soul. Eventually, the abbot declared that the hours that never were to be honored like any others. Bells would not mark them, for they could not be measured. But when they came, the brothers were to stop their work and rest. Some prayed during those hours, some simply sat, listening. Others walked the cloisters in silent meditation, feeling the pulse of the world beneath their feet. And so the rhythm of the abbey changed entirely. There were now 21 hours in the day, or sometimes 22 or 23. No one kept count anymore. Time had become not a sequence, but a circle. One evening in early spring, if spring could still be called spring, Brother Simeon sat by the fountain. The water glowed faintly in the moonlight, moving in slow arcs. The stars above seemed larger, nearer. He thought of Anselm, and of the night when the clock had stopped. He thought of the silence that had followed, and the warmth beneath his hand. And he wondered if perhaps Anselm had not vanished at all, but had simply become something else, a rhythm, a presence woven into the heartbeat of the world. He dipped his hand into the fountain. The water felt still and endless, like touching the face of time itself. Then he heard it, faint beneath the ripple, a slow, steady ticking, not from the tower, not from the earth, but from within his own chest. He smiled, closed his eyes, and whispered a prayer. The road that led to St. Verin Abbey had long since fallen from the maps. It was said to have been swallowed by moss and fog, by centuries of forgetfulness. The villagers at the foot of the valley spoke of it only in whispers, as one might speak of an old well that no longer drew water, or a field where the dead once lay unburied. And yet, on a pale morning that seemed neither of winter nor spring, a traveler arrived from the northern hills. He was an elderly man, stooped with age but sharp of eye, and he bore upon his back a satchel of curious instruments, brass compasses, tiny screws, fragments of crystal, and the worn face of a dismantled pocket watch that glimmered like an open eye. He called himself Octavian of Karsfeld, though few remembered that name when later the story spread. Some said he had once been a court clockmaker in the city of Gerun. Others swore he had been dismissed for heresy, for claiming that time was not divine order, but a wound that might one day heal. He had heard of St. Vern Abbey through a fragment of an old letter found in the archives of a dying nobleman. The letter spoke of an anomaly, a monastery where the sun lingered, where bells tolled unseen, where monks aged neither swiftly nor slow. And so the old man set out to find it. For many days he walked through forests that deepened into silence. The path narrowed to a trail, then to a mere idea of a road, swallowed by fog. He followed not the stars, for the stars seemed wrong, nor the sun, which wandered too low, but the faint, rhythmic sound that came from far away, a slow, patient beating, like the heart of the world. It grew stronger as he walked. Sometimes it quickened when he lost his way, as though calling him back. Sometimes it faded, like a breath withdrawing when he strayed too far. He slept beneath trees whose roots had twisted into strange spirals. He dreamed of clocks without hands, of monks whose shadows moved independently from their bodies, and of a face, gentle, bearded, illuminated from within by the glow of some internal mechanism, watching him with both sorrow and serenity. When he woke, he always found a single gear beside him, small and shining, though he could not say where it came from. On the 7th day, or perhaps the 70th, Tavian reached the gates of the abbey. The gates were high and iron-bound, but rusted over. The carvings of saints upon them had worn smooth, their faces erased by centuries of rain. Yet from beyond, there came the unmistakable sound of bells, slow, resonant, unhumanly precise. He pushed open the gate. It yielded without resistance, swinging inward with a sigh like the exhalation of a sleeping giant. Inside, the courtyard lay in soft mist. Grass grew between the stones, but not wildly, as if each blade knew its place. The air smelled of oil and incense. The sky above shimmered faintly, as though painted upon glass. The abbey stood silent, but alive. Its windows burned with the steady light of candles, though no smoke rose from the chimneys. The fountain at the center still ran, the water falling in slow, dreamlike arcs. Tavian stepped forward, and as he did, he realized that his own heart had begun to match the rhythm of the unseen clock that pulsed through the ground. He wandered through the cloisters. No one came to meet him. His footsteps echoed twice, the second echo faint and delayed, as if it came from far away, or from another time altogether. He found the refectory. The benches were set for a meal long finished, bowls half filled with what might have been broth, though they did not spoil. He found the scriptorium. Candles burned beside open books, and the ink upon the pages still glistened wet. He called out, softly, reverently. No answer came. It was not an empty silence. It was the silence of breath held. The air itself seemed to listen. Then faintly, from somewhere above, he heard the steady tick of gears, the hum of motion, a sound not of decay, but of perfection. He climbed the tower. The stairs spiraled endlessly upward, or so it felt. The higher he climbed, the older the air became, thick with dust and centuries. And yet the higher he went, the clearer grew the light. It was not sunlight, nor the glow of any candle. It was the color of old gold and dawn mingled, serene and endless. At last he reached the belfry. There stood the great clock, immense and intricate. Its face was open, its gears exposed, and at its center, beneath the pendulum, something glowed. Tavian stepped closer. It was not a mechanism at all, not entirely. It was a heart of glass and light, beating slowly, rhythmically, within a cage of brass ribs. Each pulse sent a tremor through the tower, a vibration that seemed to ripple out into the valley below. And on the wall, like a shadow preserved in dust, was the faint outline of a man kneeling.
Tavian knelt beside it. He whispered, "Saint Anselm." The heart pulsed once, gently, in answer. He wept, not from fear, but from awe. He had spent his life chasing perfection, clocks that would never drift, watches that would outlast kings, and here, in this silent place, he found it not in steel or craft, but in surrender, a heart that had become time itself, so that all might rest within its unbroken rhythm. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the small gear he had found each morning on his journey. It gleamed faintly in the golden light. When he held it near the heart, it vibrated as if recognizing its kin. Without hesitation, he placed it gently upon the mechanism. It fit perfectly. There was a sound, not loud, not harsh, but immense, like the world exhaling. The clock trembled, the walls shuddered, dust fell in streams from the rafters. Then, all at once, everything grew still. Down below, the monks, who had not aged a day in all those unmeasured centuries, stirred. One by one, they rose from their prayers, their meals, their sleep. They walked in silence to the courtyard, where the fountain now shimmered like liquid glass. They did not speak, for they understood. The rhythm had changed. The hours that never were ending. Centuries passed. The valley changed its name, its language, its borders. Empires rose and fractured into silence. Roads shifted, rivers altered course. The Abbey of St. Varon became no more than a shadow upon an old map, a line of ink curling through a forgotten fold of parchment. Where the tower once stood, the forest crept back. Ash trees took root in the cracked courtyard. Moss veiled the fountain and soft green fir. The clock's face, once luminous, had been claimed by ivy and the patient fingers of rain. But sometimes, when the wind slid down the valley from the north, the villagers swore they could hear it, a faint, steady beat, like the memory of a bell behind the clouds. Children grew up hearing that sound, not with fear, but with comfort, for it came only at dusk and vanished with the first owl's cry. It was said that no one who slept during the tolling ever dreamed of war. Above, Tavian felt his heart slowing. He smiled faintly and closed his eyes. "Perfect," he whispered. The pendulum stopped. Then, slowly, it began again. But this time in a new rhythm, softer, more human. And as it moved, the brothers below began to hear something new within the sound. A faint echo of breathing, a voice beneath the tick, the voice of the clockmaker himself, praying in unison with the saint who had become time. That night, for the first time in memory, the abbey's bells rang not one note, but 12. The villagers below woke and saw the tower blaze with golden light, brighter than dawn, softer than candle flame. When they came to the gates in the morning, they found them open. Inside, there were no monks, only empty robes folded neatly upon the benches, a fountain whose water no longer moved, and a great clock whose hands pointed always to midnight. And yet, if one listened closely, the faint ticking could still be heard, not from the tower, but from within the chest of every living thing in the valley.
In the summer of the year of our dying Lord 1389, a scholar from the southern coast arrived. His name was Brother Leontius of Myre, a historian of lost orders and vanished saints. He had read of the abbey in an inventory of tithes, a brief cryptic note that mentioned one bell remaining, weight unknown, tone perpetual. Leontius was a man accustomed to dust and patient research. He carried no sword, only quills, and his back was bent from years of writing. The townsfolk thought him mad for wishing to climb into the forest, for the abbey was a place where the hours were said to blur, where travelers returned with hair gone white or hearts gone still. But he smiled, thanked them, and went alone. The forest greeted him, not with menace, but with fatigue. Branches drooped as though weary of their own existence. Stones sank halfway into the soil. The air carried a faint metallic tang, like the breath of a long dormant machine. Leontius followed the ghost of a path, two faint ruts filled with ferns, until he reached what might once have been a gate. It stood half-buried, and upon its iron curve a single emblem remained, a circle crossed by 12 lines, faintly visible beneath layers of rust. He touched it, and for a heartbeat the air seemed to thrum beneath his fingertips. Inside the ruined cloister, the silence was complete. Even the birds held their voices. The scholar paused, adjusting to the dim. There were arches still intact, draped in vines, and beneath them the hint of frescoes, faces erased, halos faded to the color of bone. He felt the curious calm that sometimes comes in abandoned churches where time no longer knows how to behave. His own pulse slowed, his breathing deepened. He began to write notes in his ledger, but the ink refused to dry, as if the air itself wished to preserve everything unfinished. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Light changed color, filtering through branches, becoming gold, then violet, then a shade without name. When he reached the tower, he found the door intact. It opened inward with no sound. Within, the air was dry and faintly warm. He expected ruin, dust, cobwebs, collapse, yet what he found was something closer to sleep. The great clock still stood, its frame unbroken, its brass dulled but whole. Gears rested as if mid-breath, the pendulum hung motionless but not inert. He raised his lantern and saw that beneath the thin layer of dust the metal shimmered faintly with its own inner light. He touched the pendulum. It was cool, and for a moment he felt it move, not a swing, but a heartbeat. A low vibration rolled through the tower, subtle and distant, as though the earth had remembered something it had once tried to forget. He stepped back. The air thickened. From somewhere above, dust cascaded in slow, spiraling drifts. The clock began to tick. Not loudly, not with mechanical certainty, but gently, a sound halfway between breath and prayer. Each beat echoed through the floor, across the courtyard, out into the forest. Leaves trembled, the distant stream paused its murmuring. And the historian understood. The heart of Saint Anselm, sealed within brass and glass, had waited not for repair, but for remembrance. The moment someone spoke its name again, time had found its rhythm. He sank to his knees. He felt no fear, only an immense peace, like the calm after confession. The light within the clock deepened, spreading along the gears, until the entire tower glowed like a lantern wrapped in fog. Then the pendulum moved in earnest, slow and solemn. One swing, another. With each, the forest outside seemed to breathe, leaves exhaling dew. When it reached the 12th beat, the sound faded into silence. Centuries passed. The valley changed its name, its language, its borders. Empires rose and fractured into silence. Roads shifted, rivers altered course. The Abbey of St. Varan became no more than a shadow upon an old map, a line of ink curling through a forgotten fold of parchment. Where the tower once stood, the forest crept back. Ash trees took root in the cracked courtyard. Moss veiled the fountain in soft green fur. The clock's face, once luminous, had been claimed by ivy and the patient fingers of rain. But sometimes, when the wind slid down the valley from the north, the villagers swore they could hear it, a faint, steady beat like the memory of a bell behind the clouds. Children grew up hearing that sound, not with fear, but with comfort, for it came only at dusk and vanished with the first owl's cry. It was said that no one who slept during the tolling ever dreamed of war. Above, Tavian felt his heart slowing. He smiled faintly and closed his eyes. "Perfect," he whispered. The pendulum stopped. Then, slowly, it began again, but this time in a new rhythm, softer, more human. And as it moved, the brothers below began to hear something new within the sound, a faint echo of breathing, a voice beneath the tick, the voice of the clockmaker himself praying in unison with the saint who had become time. That night, for the first time in memory, the abbey's bells rang not one note, but 12. The villagers below woke and saw the tower blaze with golden light, brighter than dawn, softer than candle flame. When they came to the gates in the morning, they found them open. Inside there were no monks,
only empty robes folded neatly upon the benches, a fountain whose water no longer moved, and a great clock which hands pointed always to midnight. But if one listened closely, the faint ticking could still be heard, not from the tower, but from within the chest of every living thing in the valley.